Hey there, Steph.
Hey there, Sarah. How you doing?
You- Okay. Do you think this is going to be the episode that gets us cancelled?
Maybe me.
I feel like, oh, really? I feel like the things that I said were a little bit more.
I don't know. I feel like for
Oh
sure I'm
no,
going to
I
be
feel
called
like, oh,
out.
isn't that interesting? We'll
Hmm.
check it in the edit. Yeah, as people may have seen from the title of this video, this is a book review of Ultra Processed People by Chris Van Tulleken, who is a doctor and I guess he's like a journalistic kind of character as well. Like he goes and he's done documentaries and TV presenting and
He's a
um
professor, he's a broadcaster, and he wrote a book about processed food essentially and how ultra processed food, which he calls throughout the book UPF, is harming our weight, and our microbiome and our health, and how it's actually really harmful to us. And so, of course, we wanted to speak to it because this is something that comes up a lot in restriction and orthorexia and things like that, as well as just any kind of judgment of food and moralization of food.
Mhm. And so we would like to encourage anybody who thinks
Mm,
this might not be for them to not listen.
yeah. I say in the episode that if you are in the stages of trying to deconstruct food rules and take away all of the noise in your head about what you should and shouldn't be eating, that this would not be this it kind of what we talk about, it doesn't matter. So whether these kinds of foods are harmful or not, what's more important is figuring out the food relationship before factoring these kind of things in. So it's not going to be helpful to listen to it, I think, if you are still working on that piece.
Yes. If you've been listening to us for a while, you'll know that nuance is our thing. So this is trying to take a nuanced look at something that's often spoken about in a very black and white way. Any specific trigger warnings that you can think of?
A little bit about bulimia, and there are, I think that was pretty much it from
Yeah,
except the
yeah,
obvious trigger of like, we don't want to be propagating any moralization of food, which this book does.
yes, indeed. If you want to
Never mind.
listen to it, but like,
We probably don't. Today we're talking about the book Ultra Processed People by Chris Van Tulleken. What?
did you not know that the cover was very different in the
No,
UK to the US?
I
Yeah,
didn't. Whose do you like better?
I was very intrigued. You like yours better?
I said, whose do you like better?
Oh, I like this one better.
Do you?
Yeah, I don't know what it
Yeah.
is about. So just for the listener who's, unless you're watching this on YouTube, Steph
We're
and I are holding copies of our book, Ultra Processed People up, and the covers are completely different because mine's the UK version and Steph's would have been for US people, which I'm also intrigued about because it talks a lot in here about things like VAT and policies and stuff in the UK. And then it jumps
yes.
to America as well. And I wondered
Yeah.
whether any of that might be different. It might be, but we'll get to that. Before we begin, how are you feeling about reviewing this book?
A little nervous.
Hmm. About or because?
Because typically, but this topic is rife with it, there are ways of talking about this that are going to be helpful to some and harmful to others. And so getting the message across in a way that feels good is going to potentially be tricky in parts. There's going to be other
Yes.
parts that aren't tricky at all.
Yes. Well, when I was reading it, there were a few things I was reading, and I thought, gosh, if I was somebody who was vulnerable to health anxiety, this might trigger my health
Oh
anxiety.
yeah.
And I was like, if only. And then I thought, I'm reviewing this with somebody who is vulnerable to some health anxiety,
Right.
depending on what's going on.
Yeah.
So I just wondered how that part was for you specifically.
Okay, well, if this book was talking about like cancer, I would be not able to talk about it probably. But it's talking about food demonization and health, which I am pretty armored against. So it did not trigger that part of me because it's not anything I have not run up against before. This is the heart of my orthorexia. And in my recovery, I did research that, and like I worked through so much of that this is something that I had. It did not trigger me in that sense at all. However, we can talk about the ways in which my thoughts around it, where they started in orthorexia, then what happened to them as I was deconstructing things in recovery, and where they land now.
Yes, that's a good idea. Also, I just want to say something about bias. Because when I read a book like this, I'm coming from it as somebody who has recovered from various disordered eating and as somebody who helps other people and who's thinking, how is this information helpful or not helpful, potentially harmful to people with disordered eating? So that's the lens that I take in this information. He does this thing throughout the book where he presents study after study after study about this indicates, and it's always an indication. That's the problem with nutrition science and research. It's like this indicates this is harmful. And then he'll say things like, there is studies to say that they're not harmful, but they were funded by people who had an investment in the outcome, i.e., the processed food industry. So then that is, of course, a massive problem in research. But all research has some bias. Like when any researcher is conducting something, there's usually an outcome they're expecting and an outcome that they want. So by all means, yes, that can make the research unreliable. But what I don't think he does once is actually deconstruct a piece of research that was funded by the food industry and say, the methods in this research were not good because. And that was one of my issues because he's talking about it as if he's coming at it as an unbiased journalist. And he's been debunking this stuff for years. So when he decides to sit down and write a book like this is the lens. This is the message that has been shown to the publishers that have said, yes, that's what we're going to do. It is a different motivation, but I'm not talking about motivation, just simply bias, which we're all going to have. So that, I think, is just one of the points that I want to make at the beginning.
I felt like the book was largely opinion.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. I didn't feel it was scientific.
As will this podcast be.
Yeah, but just to name, it didn't feel like a journalist wrote it necessarily. I mean, not entirely, not so. I mean, he does reference things, but as far as a journalistic investigation, I thought it was very biased and opinion based.
But it's like when he does his own research, he eats an 80% ultra processed food diet. And at the end, he's having all these tests done. One of them is a brain scan. And his explanation of the brain scan is so non-neurological or scientific. It's like, what are you actually saying? He says, after my diet, the connectivity between several regions increased, especially the areas involved in the hormonal control of food intake. He doesn't at any point say what areas of the brain they are. That doesn't mean new pathways are. There is some scanning they can do to see what kind of activity has been, but he doesn't even break that down for us. That, if that's true, that's super significant.
Yeah.
But none of that is explained properly, as could other reasons for that potentially be.
Like a misleading one. I will say that, we have reviewed books in the past, and I think, to speak to my own evolution, let me pat myself on the back here a little. I think in the past, I have read each and every book we've ever reviewed defensively, because my bias is, how does this impact people with eating disorders or people who have, who are in recovery from eating disorders? And from that lens, I will still speak. And I want to name that at the outset. And I want to name something about that in a moment about that. But I really tried to read this book from a lens of neutrality as much as I could, or at least not neutrality, but like from both sides. So I was trying to read this book from a really sincerely non-defensive lens. And for that reason, I didn't get so triggered reading the book. And I actually found that in the beginning of the book, I was more defensive, and I have all these notes to reflect that. I wasn't defensive as much, but I was like more like, no, poke a hole, poke a hole, poke a hole. Middle of the book, I was like, all right, I can see this point, this point, this point. Here it is through a disordered eating recovery lens, but all right, I'm going to give you these things. And then by the end, I had gone back to like poke a hole, poke a hole, poke a hole. So I have a little bit of a different, I think maybe my review will be different than you might expect, because I tried to be a little less biased. And I think there were places in which, I feel safer to talk about some of the things that he brings up and to think about them less defensively. Why don't we talk first actually about what this book is about?
Yes, good idea. Well, he's talking about ultra processed foods, and he uses the NOVA system because one of the biggest debates, I guess, with ultra processed food and processed food is what constitutes it, because everything is a spectrum with food. So there's a NOVA system. So it might be worth me just reading. It's just a couple of paragraphs, but it explains these 4 different categories of food, going from least processed to most processed. It divides food into 4 groups. The first is unprocessed or minimally processed foods. Foods found in nature like meat, fruit, and vegetables, but also things like flour and pasta. Group 2 is processed culinary ingredients, including oils, lard, butter, sugar, salt, vinegar, honey, starches, traditional foods that might well be prepared using industrial technologies. They are not the things we can survive on because they tend to be nutrient poor and energy dense. But mix them with stuff from the first group, and you've got the basis of some delicious food. Group 3 is processed food, ready made mixtures of groups 1 and 2, processed mainly for preservation. Think tins of beans, salted nuts, smoked meat, canned fish, chunks of fruit in syrup, and proper freshly made bread. And then we come to group 4, ultra processed foods. And it goes like this: formulations of ingredients, mostly of exclusive industrial use, made by a series of industrial processes, mainly requiring sophisticated equipment and technology.
So funny because the book is about that latter category, the
Yes.
ultra processed.
Yes.
But I think within that, and he does speak to this a bit, that is there's a wide spectrum in there. I feel like that as a category is like that deserves breaking down, and he does a bit. In fact, there's a part where he says, you know how you know how sometimes we'll hear anything more than 5 ingredients is ultra processed, and he said that distinction of 5 versus 6 is very arbitrary, and it's kind of more about the quality of those ingredients. So there are certain ingredients he talks about, like gums versus carrageenan.
Emulsifiers.
Yeah, like these kinds of things are considered part of that ultra processed, but even within that, there's differences in those things. And he also says that 1 to 2 of those ingredients has been shown. And again, he doesn't go into the science too much of it, but he says, studies may show that there's no significant impact of an ingredient on your microbiome, which is one of the areas that he talks about it, influencing. But that many of these foods, many of these ingredients over time, over days, like that there's a distinction between having some versus having many. And so I felt like the book's argument was saying, because he tried to be much like Chris Fairburn, he tried to be not biased. And I think his way of doing that was saying, like, look, maybe our bodies can process some, but the degree to which this is available in our world is beyond that. And that the kind of the doses and the poison kind of thing. So that was an argument that he made that I did want to name, because I don't think this book was just looking at that latter category without that nuance.
And he makes a big point at the beginning about being weight neutral and about weight not being a personal failing. How would you summarize the conclusion of the book?
About what we to do about it?
Yes. Because I've got one for you if you like. So I went on Amazon to look at reviews, and this one was someone who gave it 3 stars. It was it was a good review because it was looking at it from a few angles, but it just kind of made me giggle the way they summarized what his takeaway was, if you like. So they said, I feel like I want to name this person just because someone called Ms. Kerry says, there's also a bit of a muddled end section to this book, which essentially boils down to eat UPF, which is what is ultra processed food. He calls it UPF throughout. Eat UPF if you like. I have used my willpower to stop. Willpower, which exists for him apparently, and I lost weight as a result. But maybe that's not for you. As long as you have a choice, which you don't currently have, but could have in the future, then that's fine. Do what you fancy. And I was like, that's true. That's kind of this message. And he talks about when he first does his own experiment, he has a month of 0 ultra processed foods. And he talks about during that time, like craving processed foods and really looking forward to this next one. Because he's saying we know that self-denial increases your desire for these foods. So then he has the foods, but then his message, he tries to feed off of, have you heard of Alan Carr's Easy Way to Give Up Smoking before? Okay, so if anyone hasn't, it's a great book. I read it and it worked for me way back in the day when I was a smoker. And you read the book and it just deconstructs all these beliefs and all these things you hold about smoking. And it takes away the desire to smoke. And it's really well done and it worked. And it was easy for me. And he's trying to suggest that he's done the same thing here for ultra processed foods, that carry on eating ultra processed foods whilst you read about how horrible they are, and then you will just no longer desire them. And I just don't think that
Yeah.
that's true. I don't think that that works.
Okay. And here's why. And again, this felt like I even still to this moment feel like there's a cloudiness between what was Fairburn and what was him, because they both, to me, felt like men of a certain privilege with diet culture in their households who set out to prove something that they intended to prove using biased experiments that neglected their biology. So in the beginning, he restricted, and then he went into like having 80% of his diet be these foods, and talked about how quickly he got, one, addicted to them, as he kind of frames it, and two, how much he gained weight. And all I could think was, is that a product of the UPF or of the food? Because you're having a reaction to restriction. Like, if you restrict, or if you're coming from a restrictive mentality, which, look, I don't have proof for it, but the things he says about the beliefs about food, the morality around food, even as he's talking about how he's come to this different realization about people who have the O word, obesity, right? He talks about it like he's come to a new understanding about that, but there's still lots of stuff in there. I'm like, oh, you're there, but you're not there. You're still talking about it in this way that shows bias. Because of that, you can't know if that period of time where he suddenly felt like, oh, all I can think about are these foods and I'm gaining weight from these foods. That happened to me too when I was in recovery, because I wasn't allowed and then I was allowed. So that whole biological component of restriction, again, it wasn't Fairburn's book. What's the other book we did? Hunger Habit.
Yes.
That's the one. That's what I mean. Sorry. Those two authors had seemed to come from that same place of there is diet culture inside of the belief system, even though you've said that you've deconstructed. I can see it just by the things that are said. And from what you're describing about how your household runs and the way you talk about food. And then you're going into these experiments that are supposed to prove that the variable is X or Y. I think the variable is A and B. Like, I think that the variable is restriction, and whether that's physical and or mental, and that's causing those things.
Well, prior to his month on UPF, he had a month with 0 UPF, in which he said he didn't weigh himself, but he noticed that his trousers were a lot looser. So he just lost weight in that month. Talked about looking forward to the UPF diet because he's missing these foods that he is using willpower to deny himself.
Right.
So then, of course, but for me, that's also what happened with his 3-year-old, Lyra.
Yes.
He talks about bringing Cocoa Pops, which you call, what do you call them?
Cocoa Puffs.
Puffs. Okay, we say pops, you say puffs.
Yeah.
Brings these Cocoa Pops into the house. And then he doesn't want her to have them. So he's trying to say no, 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 and hide this big yellow box with a monkey on. So when she wears him down and she's able to have some, of course it's going to be more exciting. If I'm 3 years old and I'm trying to get something and you're saying no, 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 and then you're like, go on then. I'm like, well, these are even more exciting because of your reaction and your behavior around it too. And he acts like she's some little addict because she has like 3 bowls of Cocoa Pops.
Oh yeah, he really pathologizes her.
Oh yeah.
This is it. And I feel like I would like to talk about the premise of this book absent of that, but I wanted to really name that whether his claims are right or wrong based on science, this interpretation of events based on his experiments are inherently flawed. And if I'm going to believe anything he says in this book, it's not at all because of that. Like, it's not at all because of those anecdotes he gives about himself or his daughter, because inherently in them is you've just confounded the results by restricting. And therefore that's moot. That this book could do without those chapters. And I could still be like, get me to the meat of the actual content. What you're talking about here is moot. The other thing that I wanted to name is that if you, and I should say this at the beginning, no matter if this book has merit or not, no matter if ultra processed foods are terrible for you or not, it doesn't, from my lens, it doesn't matter if you're trying to recover from binge eating. For me, paying attention to anything in this book, even if science came out and was like, we can 100% prove that ultra processed food is bad for you. And by the way, he doesn't really talk about as much the health aspects. He talks about the weight aspects. Like he talks more about the weight, the implications on weight than he talks about on health. He doesn't really go into that. A little, but even if you could prove that though, paying attention to that would have destroyed my recovery. Inherent in recovery for me was not paying attention to this. So I tried this time to read this book from the lens of a regulated state, right? Like of somebody where I'm no longer triggered by what's a fact and what isn't. That's not going to mess me up anymore, but it would have messed me up before. So I really want to say that if you are still in a place where even talking about this kind of stuff feels like it gets in the way of you being able to feel relaxed with food, it doesn't matter. Like it's like disregard it. It's not for now. It's the
Yeah,
same
and
thing
maybe
I
you should
talk.
stop listening here. Don't
Yeah.
even listen to the rest of this episode. That's not going to do our stats any good. But
Yeah.
if that's where you are, don't listen to the rest of this episode.
Well, I mean, because we'll say things that'll help encourage not demonizing it. But if there's any merit to it at all, which I'd also like to talk about, that could be that just is going to get in the way. It's the same way I feel about weight and stuff like that. Like if you've got food rules and food guilt and food moralization, it's just not helpful. We just got to recover. Like you can't consider something like this before in the first part. Can't put the cart before the horse here. So that's so important to me, and I really wanted to name that. But I thought his methodology was kind of crap. What's interesting, he named Cocoa Puffs, is that I read this book one day on the beach a couple weeks ago, but then we went on vacation last week. And I read it mostly in the beginning of the first half of my vacation. And my kids, we bring like Cocoa Puffs, actually, literally Cocoa Puffs, and like Lucky Charms and Cinnamon Toast Crunch. Do you have those?
With Lucky Charms, Cinnamon Toast Crunch, I don't know. Maybe
it's good.
We might now. We didn't when I was growing up.
So we bring those down to the beach every year because the kids want to. We don't have them in my house typically unless the kids ask for them, but they don't during the year. And that's a whole nother we can talk about, but like they're not typically in my home, but they are down the shore. And as I read this book, I bought 3 boxes of one of each of those cereals. Every single day, my kids it was like the mornings was like cereal mornings. That's just what they had. And when I packed to come home, no box was finished. And that struck me because it's an ultra processed food. And by his logic, it should have been gone, first day. And that's not to say that doesn't ever happen, because my kids aren't like these kind of kids that are like, oh, we just have a little of this and then we're not like, they certainly get like a certain way about certain foods and they'll mass consume things. But they didn't. Literally about the food that he was talking about with his daughter. And we brought some home. It's still there. And like, I just think that this idea that this is the only factor in consumption of food is not, it's just not, there's not enough evidence for that, even after reading his book. And I think that actually more of what he's talking about felt like dopamine to me than the ultra processed foods.
Well, his point on that was he talked about genetics quite a bit. This idea that some of us are genetically predisposed to be more food oriented.
Mm-hmm.
And anyone who's had pets, especially if you've had a few different dogs, you can see the difference in the same species of animal, that some of them are a lot more motivated by food than others. It was a confusing message because on one hand, he was going, it's not your fault. Like, this is outside of your control. This is genetic. So much of this is not your fault. And then on the flip side, it was, you can do something about it or you can't do something about it. That's the muddled message that I heard. And he even said at one point, if you think you might be addicted to food, his advice was to go to your doctor. Now, I don't know about you over there. If you go to a GP here in the UK and the NHS and you go, I think I'm addicted to food, there's nothing they're going to be able to offer. You might get a diet club membership or something like that. And we know that that's the best thing.
See, I didn't feel that he was saying there's something you can do about it. What I thought he was saying was that, yes, that there's this predisposition to food, which I could see that. Not always. And I think some of us who think we have a predisposition to food are restricting, and there's that. But I also think there's people who I feel like I have a predisposition to food, even in recovery. Like I like food more than somebody else does. I have more of an appetite for it. And he acknowledges that, and I agree. But I think what his messaging was is like, this is a social issue. It's not a fault, it's not a flaw, it's not a willpower thing, but that because these foods exist in our world, not having them is like what we have to do. But that it's not our fault that we, you know what I mean? Like it's not a willpower thing. And I think that's how he was trying to cushion it. And then at the end of the book, he talks about like how, what are we supposed to do about this? And it's more of like the work, sort of like corporations need to change. It's a capitalism issue. It's about like food companies wanting to make more food and sell more food. And this is like gold mine, like ultra processed food is a gold mine for them. It's just profit driven. So I think he was appealing to that. Now, that's going to go back to number one, the conversations we've had about psychology, because this food is around us. And I want to talk about like, what do we think of that? What do we think about the food, our food landscape, just as a culture? Because this was the part that I felt like I had less, like this was the part where I found myself less defensive and this is the part that I find the trickiest to talk about, because I don't inherently disagree with the fact that that most of the food that we consume as a culture, as a world, is convenient and fast food. Like it is this kind of what would be called ultra processed food, and that is we could by rights like not really have much quote unquote whole food, because the availability of this is just very, very strong. Now, whether or not that it does any bad or good for us is up for debate. But I do think that there is merit in, I don't know how much choice we have anymore. Like it's the psychology of these things is so strong. It is right in front of us. It is really convenient. It is really cheap from like a financial perspective. You know what I mean? And he talks about that too, like how people who have less financial privilege are going to be eating more ultra processed foods. And that piece felt, yeah, like we don't necessarily have the choices. And that's true, I think. It's just like, what are the implications of that?
That was the part of the book that I was actually really on board with. I thought I really think that we need a lot of change at the systematic level. It was concerning to me how little, what's the word? Like governance, that's not the right word, over what is put into our food, how poorly regulated that actually is, and that there are a whole list of various foods, or he would call them food-like substances, that are added to our foods that we don't even have a list of all these foods, all these substances, sorry, that are in our foods. That for me, I felt quite uneasy about that piece. I
But
think
here would
as
be
well,
the question.
Sorry?
Here's the question though, like that would imply our skepticism, or not skeptic, our concern about that, or our agreement with that would imply that what's the problem with that? These foods really bad for us? Right. So like, I guess inherently in saying, I think that we could stand to have more regulation around this stuff. Inside of that is to say, because these foods may not be good for us. So I guess the question is, and I'm going to confront myself with it, like, what is my belief about that? Like, do I think these foods are bad for us? And I think that, I can't believe I just threw myself the question. It's just such a hard thing to talk about. I think that the amount of food that is more like has less nutrition is overtaking the amount, the food in our diet. Potentially it can be. And that isn't, I don't think that's great. Like I don't, I think that's, yeah, that can be slippery for some people who, again, if I give my daughter, like an apple or Cocoa Puffs all day long, every day, she will probably eat more Cocoa Puffs. Like she's going to eat a whole bunch more Cocoa Puffs. And it's delicious. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have Cocoa Puffs. And that's also part of this nuance. I don't believe in like not having it. It's around and it's here, and restricting it isn't going to do us any favors. But the awareness of it, or like the availability of it, is going to then take up more of her diet than the turkey sandwich or whatever, you know, that has more nutrients that her body actually needs. And I do stand by that. I do think that like there and the dopamine of it. And I think it might not be about the processing. It's more about the shiny packaging and just the taste, like the reward of certain foods. If that's more available, you'll gravitate more towards that. And that will skew the amount of nutrition you get a day. You know what I mean? And so that I think that part I did agree with. And I do agree with. And I also think that if I thought about that 5 years ago, like I couldn't and I didn't. And P.S. I didn't. Like just ate the Cocoa Puffs if I wanted the Cocoa Puffs. I did not factor in anything else.
Here's one of my own, again, this is anecdotal case of one, just something that I've noticed. Do you know I love a slushie? Like
Yes.
I'm obsessed with slushies. When the weather is hot, I want me a slushie. And they sell them down on the beach and they also sell them at a shop nearby me. And the ones on the beach are actually slush puppies. Do you have that make?
We do.
Yeah. So they're slush puppy. Now the blue slush puppy, which is apparently raspberry, it's just blue slush puppy flavor as far as I'm
Blue
concerned,
raspberry. Yeah.
is my favorite. Now, of course, that's got colorings in and it's got whatever it's got in it. It's got all kinds of things in it. And then the one around the corner from me at the shop is Tango Ice Blast, which is just, it's a bit foamier, but I quite like the texture of it. But it is a sugar-free one around the. Now that one, whenever I've had that one, and now I don't have it anymore, I've had it a few times, and before I was like, this never feels good afterwards. Like my own body's response to that is it tastes slightly chemically. And because it's artificially sweetened, there's sugar in it. There's just a sense of my stomach feels a little bit queasy afterwards as well. And it just doesn't sit well in my body. My body kind of goes, no. Whereas the blue slush puppy, which no doubt, like both of these are ultra processed, by the way, I thoroughly enjoy it. I feel great afterwards. I always do. I don't have a crash. I don't have any like negative feedback from it.
Yeah.
Now I'm guessing that the Tango Ice Blast is going to have a lot more of certain kinds of ingredients in because they have to make that taste somehow because they're not using sugar. And so what I did like about what he was saying was he did do a whole thing about not demonizing sugar, but then he wasn't quite on with that all the time.
Yeah.
There's a question here, which is kind of the scary question, especially as for any of us who struggle with food or who have struggled with food and operate from this food freedom, all foods fit, no bad food philosophy, is that what if there are certain manufacturing, industrial produced substances that do have a bit of a detrimental effect on the body? Because this is the argument of the book. And that is like a slightly sticky thought. And so with that piece, where I have to land with it and where I did even in my own recovery, a big part of my recovery was prioritizing satisfaction. Said before, that was the most important intuitive eating principle to me. Well, if I do that with a slushie, it's going to be a blue slush puppy all day. It's never going to be a Tango Ice Blast. So it's probably going to be the one that is slightly less processed than that. It also means that when I'm thinking ahead to my meals, I'm thinking what's actually going to be satisfying. I'm going to be drawn more towards foods that do tend to have, let's say, a higher nutrient profile.
Yeah.
But the minute I say, and this is again like how my psychology works, I would never say to myself, because I know it's not helpful to say, I'm going to try and eat less processed foods.
Right.
That is a really sticky thought for me. It does so even now that can do something to me. So when I read this book, and there are times when he even then goes into meat and the production of meat, and I'm like, we thought we were okay with meat. That was in like, you know, number one of the Nova. That's the unprocessed. And then there's all these scary things about meat, which we don't have to go into details. And I had a moment of going like, well, nothing is ever going to be good enough. So it's a little bit frustrating. One thought that I had when I was reading it, and it's just interesting, I'm just naming it because it was there, is, you know, I'm going to be hopefully moving into my own place in 6 weeks or so, was I thought I'd quite like to make my own bread. Now, that's not to say I won't eat pre-made bread or processed bread. I'll buy a sandwich. I'll have bread anywhere. I'm not saying I'm scared of bread, but I thought, gosh, if I can motivate, and if I don't manage to do it because I'm just not the person who makes bread, I'll live with it. So I think there's this big question mark and some evidence which suggests, this is not like a proven thing, suggests that this could have some detrimental effects on the body. how do I take that possibility? Because one thing is like, oh, the accusation will be, well, you're just burying your head in the sand because you don't want to know about it. And it is hard to talk about. I realize that even now, as
So
I'm saying,
hard.
like, oh, I
Yeah,
feel
I
like
know.
I'm walking through treacle as I'm sort of trying to go. For me, there was something in my recovery. I did need to up my intake of less processed
That's
foods.
so funny. We're opposite.
Yeah, which is great. It's
Yeah.
great that that happens because like then we cast a wide net to
Yeah. Yeah.
everybody. And I could do that without fear because I'm still allowed to have all the other foods I want. But I find when I'm finding more satisfaction in these other foods, I
Yeah.
feel like my desire for the more processed foods isn't out of control.
It's hard to talk about because we're talking about it from a place of the word it's tricky, but balance now.
Mhm.
And it's true. It's sincere. But when you're in a balanced looking place and it's not coming from actual sincere regulation, then it's moral. And like the what's driving it is different. So when I got into orthorexia in 2014, I cut all ultra processed food out of it wasn't in my home. And not even in a salt shaker. Like everything. I remember I had a party. We had a birthday party for my daughter. I remember my brother-in-law came and said something to my husband because he went into our fridge to get something for coffee. And he said something to my husband to Mike about like, whoa, like your fridge doesn't have anything I even recognize. Like you know, it was very deep. And that was completely driven by control, And at that time, I started eating like fresh fruit and vegetables and all those proteins, these things. And I also had a shift in my, it's really tricky because I was also disordered. And so like there were lots of confounding variables, but I did feel I felt more energetic from when I was eating enough, which I would binge on enough. And then I would have, and something changed in my sleep patterns and things like that. But it was all coming from the wrong place. And I feel like when we talk about this now, it's like I can take what I need and leave the rest. So I take the parts that unfortunately I learned through an anorexic lens that actually served a part of me while the rest was confounding it. But like there was some value to having more produce in my life. Like there was a felt effect that I still want. I just don't want it with all the control. And like I also have like things in my fridge. Like I cannot shop like that. I can't live like that. And I don't live like that. But I still can take the parts in a more balanced way and keep them. And that is everything to this conversation because there is a way, I think, of looking at some of this stuff. And again, I don't know because he doesn't really explain it very well, like the actual science behind these ingredients. And by the way, do you know Food Science Babe? I think I've talked about her before. She's on YouTube and she's on Instagram and she's a scientist and she debunks all of the people who are talking about like, oh, get guar gum out of your diet, it'll kill you, like, and she's like, no, it won't. Here's how I know. And she goes into the science about it and she helped me so much to come out of orthorexia and she's a good resource to look at if you still are very hung up on these beliefs. And that's why I was like, okay, I can bring these foods are safe enough to bring back in. It did help me. But I'm not a scientist and I've never measured them. I've never read actual studies on this stuff. So I don't know if there are ingredients that actually impact the microbiome in the way he's saying that will then influence my depression symptoms. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. I know that I have had depression and anxiety in a very clean way of eating. So there's that. But I think that like there's a way of taking common sense into the equation which you can't do when you're disordered. And that's what I feel like is more available now, where I'm kind of like, I don't know about certain things. So I'm not going to like fill my entire world with them, but I'm just going to use common sense around balance. And that's how I feel like I live now, but that is just not accessible when you're not in balance yet. You know what I mean? Or when you have judgment and morality. Like I had to take it all down to rebuild it. And in the rebuild, it was common sense. That's what I built back in. But I couldn't have even done that before I had to destroy it all and be like, never mind what's bad for you, what you think is bad. It doesn't even matter. Like, just undo it all. And then put it back the way that makes sense for you from a place of true regulation. And I'm aware that the people we're speaking to on this podcast, well, I don't think that that's true, that none of them are there. I know people listen to this podcast who have made peace with food. It's life after diets. But there's some people who are still struggling with this idea of restrictive based eating because of these kinds of principles. And I do recommend in cases like that to look at some of the science. Food Science Babe is someone to look at, to provide the other side of the argument, so that then you can come to your own conclusions over time with both sides. And I think that that's where common sense comes from, is to be able to say, there's all this demonization, and I've read about that, but I've never had the opportunity to read about voices that are speaking to like, no, it's not bad for you. It's not, like, read that too, and then think about it. You know what I mean? But I think mostly in our society, we are only reading about the demonization, and that's not a fair play. Even if you side with it later on, or even if you believe some of that later on, like, at least you've come to that conclusion looking at two sides of a debate.
But it was interesting when he was saying that he doesn't think it's the sugar and the fat that's the problem.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people talk about processed food. It's the combination of sugar and fat that
Yeah.
makes you want to eat more. And he posits that it's the additives
Yeah, I
that
know.
actually drive because he even talks about like binging at one point, and he says, did you see this line? He said 100% of binges are on UPF. And I was like, oh,
I wrote a note. I have to talk
son,
about
no,
that.
no,
Yeah,
no, no.
I have to talk
And
about
then I
that.
was thinking, like, actually, one of my most distressing binges I had was on a homemade birthday cake
Yeah,
that was
right.
given for me. And I thought
Right.
about you as well in like your orthorexic
Yeah.
days as well, binging. And I was thinking, yeah, it speaks to the misunderstanding so much as well, just about
Yes. It was
binging too.
interesting too, because I read that book. We had potato chips at the beach as I was reading this book. And one of the potato chips was, the ingredients were potatoes and coconut oil and salt. So that would be a Nova, what, 3? Like, it wouldn't be considered ultra processed.
Yeah, just processed.
And then we had a bag of potato chips that had the long list of ingredients, some of the ones that he was citing. So it was an ultra processed. And I asked Mike was like, Mike loves, I'm more sweet. He's more salty. He loves potato chips. I can eat them both, but that's never been an issue for me to like stop eating potato chips. Whereas with him, like, he can keep eating. And he's like, it doesn't matter to me. Like, they're both, like, I could easily finish the whole bag of potato chips, the first one, as much as the second. Like, it didn't seem to, and it reminded me, I was like, yeah, I have binged excessively on like almond flour muffins that I made at home as much as I've binged on Dunkin' Donuts muffins. That's where I felt like there's more to this than the additives. There's dopamine, and there's restriction to, like, there's other factors that will contribute to eating something, like, to the degrees that we are, and that they can't all be explained by the presence of an additive.
The way he spoke about his twin brother, I found really quite heartbreaking.
Yeah,
He
me
was
too.
so horrible too. He was so judgmental. The guy who wrote the book, Chris Van Tulleken, I can never remember how you say it. Chris Van Tulleken has a twin brother, and the twin brother goes to America and then is in what did he call it? Not a food desert, but like a food where you're surrounded by processed foods. He had a name for I can't remember what it was anyway, but it's like a food something. And so the twin brother gains weight. And for a couple of years, like every time he sees his brother, he's on his brother's case about losing weight. And he admits to feeling ashamed of his brother. And
Food
then
oasis.
when he's, sorry?
Food oasis.
Food oasis, that was it. Yeah, and it isn't until he gives his brother a little bit of space and decides to just let it go and just accept his brother for who he is, that their relationship improves. And the brother was saying he used to dread seeing him, his own twin brother, because he knew he was just going to get a shed load of judgment about his weight.
It made me think, like, what kind of household did you guys grow up in? Like, did one of you subscribe to the restriction side? And you know what I mean? Like, there were too many clues in there of like, I don't know that you're not biased. I think you might be biased. He also I thought that an interesting chapter was where they talked about smell, like using like that some packaging of okay, so how the ice cream, you know me and my ice cream bars, and he was talking about how in some of these foods they put a scent of caramel in the packaging because the ice cream itself is too cold to emit scent, so that if you open an ice cream bar, you won't smell the enticing flavors. But so they put this in here so that as soon as you open it, you're like, and that when you like our olfactory sense is very connected to our pleasure and the way that that entices us towards food more and more. And I was thinking about that from the point of view of how, because his point was like, that's not how food really exists. So what is it doing to our brains to be exposed to these almost like nudges, of like, ooh, I'm gonna light up something that makes you want where it doesn't naturally exist, and how that is our brains aren't designed to handle all of that. And then I was thinking, and he does allude to this at the end too, like that's true of, I think that's what social media is like. There's so many nudges in our world today that aren't natural. And then it's like this bigger question. And this is where I feel like I felt conflicted because I'm like, there's a part of my, I don't know what's my personality or my trauma response. Like, I don't know what it is.
Same thing.
It's yeah, at this point that I feel much more like I'm a minimalist. So like I want less. I don't want all that. Like I don't want, I want everything as, I want to see everything I'm dealing with. Like I don't want, my fridge, right? Like
Do you
I
feel
want
manipulated? Do you feel manipulated?
Feel manipulated, and I feel like I'm not aware of everything. I don't want things acting on me that I don't know about.
Yeah.
So the way the world is to me, or maybe it's my introversion too. I'm like, there's too much, like the marketing, the commercial, everything's always trying to hijack me. And I'm like, no. And I'm like, I want everything as simple as possible. And that is larger than food, but it also is, becomes part of that. Like I like the homemade bread thing. I love that, but it's not because, oh, I want to do the right thing and be a good girl and have the good bread. It's like, I can see what goes in. And I don't do that. I don't make my own bread, but I like knowing the simplest, I like everything being at its simplest equation. And I was thinking about how like I have like a general rejection of anything this world is doing to sort of bring me to a place that I'm not even looking to go unnaturally. And I think that like that ice cream bar example was like, yeah, I could see that. That to me felt like, yeah, like I was at the beach. Actually, I agree with you. Like I think that it's manipulating you somehow and you don't even know.
See, that for me is the most benign thing
Really?
out of all of this. I think that's kind of fun. I was like, you're improving the experience for me.
I can appreciate that. I can,
and
but I feel manipulated first.
If it's a scent that just makes this, like more enjoyable.
If it's standalone, but to me, it represented everything. It was like the whole world is trying to get me to do what they want me to do, because that's my response. Like it speaks to my trigger, but it was a symbol of it. And I think maybe that's the point, Sarah, is like for those of us who have maybe people who write books like this, or people who are prone to orthorexia or things like that, are people who are like, don't manipulate me. It's like, no, I'm vigilant. There's no time for that, and like versus,
don't you dare give me extra pleasure.
Yeah, exactly. Like that would not be the thought. It would be like, you're trying to manipulate me. And it's about perspective. Yeah. So I can appreciate that. And I hear you. And there is a part of me that as soon as you say that, I'm like, oh yeah, that is more fun. But like at first I need to know you're doing that, so I think there's a human bias in anyone studying it and anyone reading about it and anyone podcasting about it. Like, just to be aware that I don't think you're going to get information in this world without a bias coming through it. And also without receiving it without a bias. So yeah, that's important.
What are the important things to leave people with? If anyone's listened to this episode, and I'm so aware that people will be listening in different stages of recovery or not in recovery with food, because there were bits I found when I was reading this book where I found myself feeling really bored. And I think this is a response because it's kind of me switching off a little bit, because I remember thinking if I read this with my mind wide open and just allowing everything to flood in, all this stuff can sound really scary.
Yeah.
So I think the first thing I would say is this is not a book I would recommend. I also felt like it could have been a third of the length.
Yeah.
It felt like a slog.
Yeah. I actually almost texted you to be like, are we really going to, can we maybe not do this book? I don't want to read it.
I switched to audiobooks. I'm like, I am not sitting down and reading this. So I put it on Audible and I was like, okay, at least I can get other things done, like doing the housework or going for a walk or something like that. Because, and I don't normally, if I'm doing a book review, I would normally sit down with the book.
I do want to name one thing though,
Please
because
do.
the only part, because since I read this at the beach, I didn't have my highlighter. So I just took
Mhm.
notes on my phone. But the only page in this book in which I like double creased it so that I wouldn't forget is that he says on page, in my book, it's 163. He said he was talking about his life prior to this period of time. He goes, there was a lot of UPF, ultra processed food, that I had never been tempted by, but there were certain types, mainly savory, fried, spicy, and laden with MSG foods, that I would occasionally eat to the point of vomiting. This had never struck me as disordered so much as practical. It made a good night's sleep easier if, having massively overeaten, I wasn't bursting with food. Disorder or not, at the end of my diet, all this stuff became inedible. Okay. Okay. Just to bring this home. I was like, okay, when I'm talking about there were clues and there were signs of disorder. And then on the next page, he's talking about his brother and and how he says I, along with many others, have felt very strongly addicted to food itself. So he sounds like a restrictor, like somebody who has a propensity towards food and has figured out a way to restrict or compensate. And that preceded the writing of this book and certainly the experiments in this book, and further drove home the point of why I couldn't trust him.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, we should go now record an intro that tells people not to listen.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we've left the intro to the end because we want to see where this conversation goes first. So we're saying goodbye, but we're also going to be saying hello in a minute. But you would have already heard us say hello, so we'll just say goodbye.
Oh, and I just want to apologize to anyone to whom like anything was triggering there. If you have questions, please ask.
Yeah, understood.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Bye.
Right. All right then.
That was good. That was good. I'll see you next week.
Very, very, very proficient.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Right on
Okay.
it. All right, my
Enjoy
lovely.
the rest of your evening.
Bye.